Dusk at Raven Watch. A quiet rancher finds a shaken young woman standing in the street, dress torn, eyes down. He gives his coat, sets a chair by his door, and keeps watch through the night. By morning, 3 local youths brag. Their uncle, a cattle boss, points a finger in the rancher's face. The sheriff hovers, the town holds its breath. This won't be settled with fists. It will be settled in daylight, with chalk on a sleeve, a torn thread, and a ring that tells the truth. When power leans on the law, what will one quiet man do? The last light over Raven Wash came soft and copper, laying a hush across the low hills and the thin ribbon of creek. Jonah Hale reined in at the crossing, listening to the water speak its small language over stones. He'd meant only to count the strays before night settled. Instead, he saw movement in the shallows. One figure, still as a fence post, dress torn high at the thigh, bare feet planted in the cold stream. She didn't look up. Her hands were folded to her ribs, knuckles white. Mud streaked the hem, and her shoulders trembled once, then went rigid again, like a horse trying not to show it was spent. Jonah slid down from the saddle without a word. He kept his eyes on the cottonwoods and the far slope, the way a man does when pride needs shelter. He shrugged off his coat and held it out. "Cold comes on quick," he said, voice low. "You can take this." Her lips moved. "I'm fine." "Folks say that when they ain't," he answered. He waited. The creek whispered between them. At last, she reached for the coat, gathering it close, taking back a piece of herself with the cloth. Her face stayed turned away. "There a place I can take you?" Jonah asked. A breath like a flinch, then a small shake of the head. "All right." He nodded once, not crowding her with questions that could break something delicate. "My cabin's up the rise. Warm stove, clean water. You can rest, leave at first light if that's what you want." Another silence. Finally, the smallest, "Okay." Jonah lifted her easily, careful as if moving a split board that might crack. He set her on the horse and led them up the sandy bank, steady on the reins, a quiet shadow in a quiet dusk. The sky ran out of color as they reached the porch. Inside, the one-room place smelled of coffee and pine smoke. He set a pot on the stove, fetched a blanket, laid it folded at the foot of the bed. "You got privacy," he said, keeping distance. "There's a basin there. You can wash. I got a needle and thread if you want to mend. Food's on in a minute." He paused. "No one's gonna bother you here." Her eyes flicked toward him and away, quick as a sparrow. "Thank you." He ladled stew into a tin bowl and set it on the table, backing off like a man easing a skittish colt. While she ate in small, careful bites, Jonah stepped to the door and dragged a chair to the threshold. He sat, rifle laid across his knees, boots planted. Coyotes called far off. The wash kept its hush. A long while passed. The lamp threw a soft circle against the log walls. She finished the stew, stitched in small, neat bites at her hem, then lay down on top of the quilt, coat still around her. Jonah didn't look in. He watched the yard, the corral, the black line of the hills, listening the way a man learns to when the world has edges. In town, under the yellow porch lamps of the copper lantern, Matt Crowell tilted his chair back and let his voice carry. Rory and Tate laughed too loud. Men at the bar stared hard into their glasses. Pride and liquor make a sour mix, and the boys had both. No one there was brave enough to tell them to hush, not with Vance Crowell running freight through half the county and paying tabs when it suited him. Vance's name reached farther than his shadow, and he liked it that way. "Just boys having fun," Mac said, twirling his hat. On his finger, a ring flashed one quick blue wink when it caught the light. The barkeep wiped at a clean spot and made himself small, back at the cabin. The night folded thicker. Jonah shifted once, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't young anymore. The chair creaked, but his hand stayed quiet on the rifle. He didn't love the thing. He just respected what it could do, and more, what holding it meant for the person trying to sleep 10 steps away. Sometime after midnight, the horses in the corral stirred, a restless shuffle and a soft, anxious snort. Jonah stood, slow, letting the legs wake. He eased off the safety loop on the rifle and stepped to the edge of the porch, letting his eyes work. A breath of wind moved the sage. Somewhere out there, leather whispered against wire, then was still. Jonah raised the rifle, pointed it at the sky, and fired once. The sound cracked the night open and rolled the hills. Silence rushed back in. A beat later, faint hoofbeats pattered away along the wash, quick and guilty. He waited, counting. 10, 20. The dark sealed shut, clean as a stitched seam. He set the rifle across his knees again and sat the rest of the night while the lamp guttered down. At first light, Jonah walked the corral. A gate hung not quite true. One strand of wire showed a fresh scuff, bright silver where rust had been. In the sand he found heel marks turning hard toward town, and, half print, half smear, the curve of a spur that left a crescent on the earth. He squatted, thumb against the mark, feeling the grit. He didn't say a word. Inside, the woman slept, breath even now. The sun tipped over the hills like a promise. He looked again at that crescent in the sand, and at the gate rope drawn wrong. Who circled his horses after dark, and why? Morning broke sharp and pale over Raven Wash. Jonah Hale stood at the corral, studying the gate rope he had retied before dawn. The crescent-shaped spur mark still pressed the earth like a secret note left behind. He turned the print over in his mind, weighing it the way he weighed a stray calf, quiet, steady, never rushed. Behind him, smoke curled from the chimney. Inside, the woman slept, her breath light but no longer ragged. For now, the world was still. By mid-morning, Jonah rode into town. The Copper Lantern Saloon leaned with the same creak as always, its porch half-shaded. Inside, voices carried. Mac, Rory, and Tate, Crowell's nephews, sat loud at a back table. They had their boots up, cups in hand, laughing bigger than the joke deserved. Jonah stepped through the doors. The room hushed in a ripple, men shifting eyes between him and the boys. Jonah didn't raise his voice. He just said, plain, "You left sign at my place last night. I don't aim to see you there again." Mac's grin cut sideways. "You dreaming, old man?" We was playing cards till sunup. Jonah's gaze drifted to Mac's boot, polished iron spur catching the lamplight, curve sharp as a crescent moon. "Dreams don't leave scratches on gate latches," he said. Rory barked a laugh, too quick, covering nerves. Tate muttered, "Ain't your land can't stand a little ride by?" Jonah didn't budge. "Boys, I'll say it once, leave off." He tipped his hat to the barkeep, turned, and left them with silence clinging to their laughter. That night, the wind rose, dry and restless. Jonah sat in his chair by the door, rifle across his knees. Eliza, he had learned her name that afternoon, though she gave it quiet as a secret, sat at the table mending her hem again. She didn't ask questions about town. He didn't offer. Some words didn't need air yet. Then came the thud of a gate swinging open, a rush of hooves scattering. Jonah moved fast, stepping to the porch. He didn't sight at flesh. He never did. He raised the barrel skyward and cracked a warning shot. The sound sent silhouettes streaking into the wash, dust trailing like ghosts. Inside, Eliza had risen, wide-eyed but steady. "They came again?" she asked. Jonah nodded. "Fool's courage rides easier after dark." She pulled his coat tighter. "Why?" He set the rifle down gentle. "Because men like Crowell think no one says no to them, and boys grow tall in his shadow." At dawn, the knock came. Sheriff Holt stood on the porch, hat brim low, a folded paper in hand. "Jonah," he said, "there's a complaint." Jonah took it, read the scrawled ink. "Harboring a vagrant, brandishing a firearm against minors." "They filed this?" Jonah asked. "Vance Crowell himself." The sheriff shifted, uneasy. "You know he's got half the freight business tied to his name." "Paper's paper, Jonah. Best thing is, keep the peace." Jonah met his eyes. "Peace don't come from letting wolves in the fold." The sheriff sighed, touching the star pinned at his vest. "I know, but I can't tear this up without cause. Be careful. Don't give 'em rope." When the lawman left, Jonah studied the paper a long while, then folded it once and set it on the mantel. He walked back to the corral, crouched near the wire. There it was again, a faint crescent spur mark, pressed beside a fresh nick in the post. He pressed his thumb into the dirt, memorizing its curve. Eliza stepped out onto the porch, sunlight in her hair, coat still around her shoulders. "What now?" she asked. Jonah rose slow, dust on his knees. "Now we wait for proof to fit the deed. A mark in the dirt don't lie, just needs the right eyes to see it." And maybe that's the question for you. If you were Jonah, holding a paper meant to silence you, while clear tracks told another truth, would you fight it or let it lie? Tell me in the comments, because a town story, like this one, is shaped by the voices willing to speak. Jonah Hale wasn't one to sit idle when paper tried to twist truth. After the sheriff rode off, leaving that nuisance complaint folded on the mantel, Jonah sat at his small table long into the night. The lamplight flickered, throwing shadows across a stack of worn volumes he'd kept since his scouting days. Territorial codes, property statutes, court circulars. Men out here thought him quiet, a loner. They forgot he had read more by firelight than some lawyers had in school. He turned pages steady, tracing with a calloused finger, words about trespass, affidavits, private prosecution. The language was stiff, built by men in suits far from the dust, but Jonah teased out the shape of it. A landholder could expel trespassers who tampered with stock or gates, and a sworn victim's statement carried weight enough to start action, no matter who her kin were or weren't. By the time the lamp burned low, Jonah leaned back, rubbing the ache in his shoulders. The boys had their uncle's shadow. He would need something firmer, proof that showed itself without shouting. At daybreak, Eliza found him still at the table. Her hair was loose, eyes cautious but clearer than before. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Sleep comes after fences are mended," Jonah replied. He hesitated, then slid a sheet of paper across. "You write?" She nodded. "My father taught me. Letters, sums, books, when we had them." "Good," Jonah said, voice gentle. "If you're willing, you can put down what happened. Plain words as you remember, names, details. It don't leave this room unless you say so." Her hands trembled at first, hovering over the pencil. "If I do," she whispered, "they'll come harder." Jonah met her eyes, steady. They already came. Better the truth stands taller than rumor. Silence stretched, then she drew a breath and set the pencil to paper. Her script was neat, the kind taught in small church schools. She wrote of the creek, of rough hands, of a hem torn sharp by a boot heel. She noted a missing brass button, pulled clean off in the scuffle, and Mac's turquoise chip ring glinting even in the fading light. Her words were simple, but each carried weight like a stone placed on a wall. Jonah watched without pressing, then folded the paper once she was done. "You keep a copy," he said. "This one goes where it needs to." Later, out by the corral, Jonah crouched again by the latch. He studied the scratches fresh on the iron, thin arcs that matched a spur's curve. He pulled a small ledger from his pocket, a habit left over from army supply days, and sketched the marks with a stub of graphite. Side by side with Eliza's statement, it painted a picture clearer than his voice ever could. That afternoon, Jonah saddled his horse and rode the ridgeline. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was listening for it. Along the trail, he met Dusty, the stable boy from town. The child's boots were near worn through, but his eyes were sharp. "Mr. Hale," Dusty said, tugging his cap. "I seen them three riding fast by the wash 2 nights back. One had a hat with turquoise band. Can't miss it." Jonah's brow lifted. "You sure?" Dusty nodded. "Near lost my broom chasing chickens when they thundered past." Jonah gave him a quiet smile, one of the few he let slip. "Good eyes. Keep 'em open." When Jonah returned home, Eliza was kneading bread. Her sleeves were rolled, flour dusting her forearms. The cabin smelled of yeast and warmth, a scent that softened even his guard. She looked up. "You found something?" "More than something," Jonah answered, setting the ledger on the table beside her affidavit. "A torn hem, a button, a ring, and a latch scratched by a crescent spur. It ain't loud, but it's enough." Eliza pressed her palms into the dough, slow. "Do you think the town will care?" Jonah's eyes rested on her, steady as the hills. "Care or not, they'll have to see it. Proof don't need persuasion, it just needs daylight." The bread rose. The sun slid low again, painting the wash in fire. Jonah felt the stir of coming days, when silence would no longer be shield, but weapon. Sunday in Raven Wash dawned bright, the air carrying the kind of stillness that coaxed folks toward the churchyard under the cottonwoods. Jonah Hale kept his hat low as he rode in with Eliza beside him. She wore his mended coat still, though she had stitched her dress enough to hold. Her steps were careful, but she stood straighter now, chin not tucked so deep. The church bell called. Steady. Families spread quilts beneath the trees. Children ran in dust, and the long tables filled with pies and bread loaves. Jonah guided Eliza to a shaded spot near Mrs. Bell, a widowed neighbor with sharp eyes softened by years of loss. Mrs. Bell gave a kind nod. "Morning, Jonah." Miss Eliza dipped her head. "Eliza Rowan, ma'am." The widow's gaze lingered on her, seeing more than words gave. I thought I saw you two ride in last dusk, quiet-like, and I recall 3 boys tearing down the road, one hat catching the sun with turquoise. No decency in their speed, Jonah filed it away with a small nod. Mrs. Bell wasn't a woman to gild a story. A little later, Dusty the stable boy came bounding across the grass, broom tucked under one arm like always. He tugged at Jonah's sleeve. "Mr. Hale, I found this by your wash." From his pocket he produced a brass button, dulled but distinct. "Saw a blue thread on your fence, too." Thought it might matter. Jonah's jaw tightened, but he put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It matters. Keep it safe." The boy's face lit at the trust. "Yes, sir." Nearby, an old figure shuffled forward. Prospector Wicks, bent as the handle of his pick, leaned heavy on his cane. His voice cracked but carried. "Saw Crowell's freight wagon roll past your lane, Hale." Odd hours, not his route. Thought it curious. Jonah's eyes flicked toward him. "You certain?" "Certain as dust on my boots," Wicks muttered, settling back. Eliza stood silent, listening to every word, her fingers curling around the edge of the quilt. Her breath came quicker, but she did not flinch away. Jonah saw the courage in that, quiet and raw. The afternoon carried on with hymns, laughter, and plates passed hand to hand. To the crowd, it was another Sunday. To Jonah, it was testimony scattered in fragments, waiting to be gathered. Proof needed no loud tongue, just careful ears. Later, back at the cabin, Jonah took chalk from a drawer and crouched on the porch step. He drew a square for the corral, a hinge for the gate, small marks for the scratches. He added the brass button, the turquoise ring, the snagged thread. Beside him, Eliza watched, brow furrowed. "You're building a map," she said softly. "A map that speaks plainer than my word," Jonah answered. He drew one last line, straight and firm. "They think bluster hides truth, but truth has its own weight. All I need is for it to show itself, plain, when eyes can't look away." Eliza touched the edge of the chalk drawing. "And if they still turn?" Jonah met her gaze, steady. "Then the line holds just the same. Some fences you keep, not because others respect them, but because you must." The sun dipped low, painting the wash in copper. The cabin stood small but solid, the air thick with bread cooling on the sill. The night would come soon, and with it, perhaps more testing of ropes and gates. Yet Jonah felt the pieces aligning, testimony, objects, scratches on iron, all waiting for the moment when silence could give way to daylight. Eliza rose, folding her arms as the wind tugged at her hair. "What simple thing," she asked, half to herself, "can make guilt show itself plain?" Jonah didn't answer. He only looked at the chalk on his hands, the quiet proof in his ledger, and the weight of the ring and button waiting their turn to speak. The days after the church picnic felt charged, as though Ravenwash itself waited for something to break. Jonah Hale moved with the same quiet rhythm, feeding stock, splitting wood, patching fence rails. But beneath it all, he was setting pieces into place. Eliza watched him closely. She had seen men bluff with fists before. Jonah was different. He leaned on silence, on patience, on the kind of steadiness that unsettled those who thrived on noise. One morning he saddled his bay and rode into town. Eliza stayed behind kneading dough, the scent of yeast filling the cabin. Though her thoughts rode with him, Jonah tied off at the sheriff's office, stepped inside, and laid 2 papers flat on the scarred desk, Eliza's sworn statement and a request for trespass warrants against the 3 boys. Sheriff Holt squinted, pushing his hat back. "Jonah, you know what this means. Crowell will raise thunder." "Thunder don't scare me," Jonah said. "Truth holds steady if folks will look at it." The sheriff rubbed his jaw. "All right, I'll file them, but you best keep your guard up. Crowell's not a man who takes kindly to being crossed." Jonah only nodded and tipped his hat. His work was done here. Back at the cabin, he reset the corral gate with care. He greased the hinge so it would squeal no more, then dusted the strap with fresh chalk. Anyone who handled it would carry the mark on a sleeve or glove. Next, he strung a thin wire from the latch to a tin cup by his bed. One tug, and the bell would sing in the night. Eliza stood watching, flour still on her hands. "You're setting a trap. Not for hurt," Jonah replied. "For proof. Folks doubt words. They can't doubt what. They see plain." That evening, Eliza brought bread to the table, the crust golden, the inside soft and steaming. Jonah cut a slice, nodding approval. "You've a good hand for it," he said. She smiled faintly, brushing flour from her skirt. "Bread holds better than fear." My mother used to say that as night fell, Jonah checked the wire one last time and set the rifle against the wall. Best rest easy, he told her. If they come, we'll hear it. The bell did not ring that night, but trouble came by day instead. Late morning, as Jonah watered the horses, a rider thundered into the yard. Vance Crowell himself, his coat dusted from the trail, reined in hard. He swung down and jabbed a finger near Jonah's chest. "You've gone too far, Hale." "Filing papers against my kin?" Jonah didn't flinch. "I filed truth. Nothing more." Crowell's eyes narrowed. "You fired on boys. Sheriff says you raised a rifle." Jonah's voice was even. "Sky took that shot, not flesh. You know it," Crowell snarled, turning on his heel. "The sheriff will take that rifle from you. Mark me." He mounted and rode off, dust rising in his wake. True enough, by sundown, Sheriff Holt arrived, uneasy. "Jonah," he said. Crowell pressed hard. "I've got to take the rifle for safekeeping." Till the hearing, Jonah didn't argue. He handed it over the stock first. "A man's got more than guns," he said. "I've got hands, too." The sheriff studied him, then gave a slow nod before riding back toward town. Inside, Eliza stood by the window, worry plain in her eyes. "They're closing in." Jonah placed a hand on the chair by the door. "Let them." Truth has a way of standing when lies fall. Night fell heavy and still. The cup and wire waited. Jonah sat with chalk dust still faint on his fingers, listening for the bell's first song. The bell never rang that night. Jonah Hale sat in the chair by the door till dawn, the wire cup still silent, the chalk line on the strap untouched. Yet he knew men like Crowell wouldn't let a day pass without pushing harder. Trouble would not wait long. He saddled his bay and rode with Eliza into town at first light. She wore the coat still, but she walked with steadier steps, carrying a basket of bread she meant for Mrs. Bell. Jonah admired that, strength rising in her, piece by piece. On Main Street, the three Crowell boys were leaning against the mercantile rail. Mac flicked his turquoise band hat with a finger, smirk wide. When Eliza passed, he shifted to block her path, shoulder brushing too close. Jonah was off his horse before the dust settled. He placed a hand against Mac's chest, firm but not rough, and guided him aside. "That's far enough," he said. Mac sneered. "You think you're her keeper now, Hale?" Jonah's eyes stayed steady. "I think no woman should be jostled on her way to church or store." "That's all." Rory barked a laugh, and Tate muttered something sharp, but Jonah ignored them. He turned to Eliza. "Go on inside." She obeyed, shoulders square though her hands trembled at the basket's handle. It was then that Vance Crowell stormed from the saloon, voice booming. "Assault!" he bellowed, pointing a finger that shook with fury. "Sheriff, you saw it. He laid hands on my nephew." Sheriff Holt had been standing across the way, arms folded, jaw tight. He hesitated, the weight of politics heavy on his badge. Crowell pressed harder, his words like a hammer. "You're sworn to uphold the law." "Arrest him." The sheriff's shoulders sagged. He stepped forward, eyes meeting Jonah's. "Jonah, I don't like this, but I've got to put you in the cell. Overnight only, no chains. Just till tempers cool." Jonah nodded once, unflinching. "Do your duty, Sheriff." He handed the reins of his horse to Dusty, who had crept from the stable to watch. "See him watered," Jonah told the boy. Dusty nodded, eyes wide. The walk to the jail was quiet, townsfolk watching from porches and windows. Inside, the cell was bare. Iron bars, a wooden bunk, and a tired clock ticking slow on the wall. Holt locked the door with a sigh. "I'll see this don't go farther than tonight." Jonah settled on the bunk, leaning back against the wall. He felt no shame, only the weight of patience. An hour later, Eliza came with a cloth bundle. She slid it through the bars, hands steady. "Bread," she said softly, "and coffee." Jonah accepted it, nodding thanks. Her presence mattered more than the food. She lingered, eyes searching his face. "Does it feel like they're winning?" she asked. Jonah broke the bread in half. "Winning's not about noise. It's about what holds after the noise dies." Before she could answer, a small figure slipped through the door, dusty, breathless, clutching a folded rag. "Mr. Hale," he whispered, "I swiped this from the saloon rail." He unwrapped it to reveal Mac's turquoise band ring, the one Jonah had marked in his ledger. On the cloth beside it lay a sleeve scrap dusted with chalk smear. Jonah let a rare smile tug at his mouth. "Good eyes, boy. You've got a sharper hand than men twice your age." Dusty grinned, proud. "I figured proof matters more than talk." Jonah nodded. It does. Now go on before you're missed. The boy scampered off, leaving the cell quiet again. Jonah turned the ring over in his hand, the chalk trace still visible, then laid it atop his ledger sketch of the latch. Piece by piece, the wall was being built. Outside, Main Street bustled, unaware that a trap had already sprung, not with violence, but with patience and small, steady acts. Jonah leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. Tomorrow, the town would have to look where they'd refused to see. Morning sun climbed high and hot over Raven Wash, burning the dew from the church roof and sending dust curling off Main Street. Sheriff Holt stood square in front of the jailhouse, hat brim pulled low, voice carrying. Folks, gather round. We'll have a hearing here and now. Too much talk has festered. Time for light on it. The crowd thickened. Ranch hands, merchants, women clutching children's hands. Vance Crowell strutted forward with his nephews, their laughter too loud, their boots scuffing like they owned the ground. Jonah Hale stepped out of the cell behind the sheriff, unshackled, tall and calm as ever. Beside him walked Eliza, her hands folded tight, but her gaze fixed straight ahead. Crowell sneered, sweeping a hand. This is foolishness, Holt. A drifter woman's word against my blood. Hale here is twisting scraps into stories. These are good boys, not criminals. Jonah's voice came quiet but sure. Then let the truth show itself. The sheriff, wearied but fair, nodded. What do you propose, Jonah? Jonah pointed toward the corral at the edge of the town. A simple thing. Let them close a gate. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Crowell scoffed. A parlor trick. Sometimes truth looks simple, Jonah said. Together they walked to the small stock pen, townsfolk trailing behind. Jonah bent to the hinge, greased smooth and dusted fresh, chalk along the strap. He spoke plain for all to hear. This is how I found it at my place. Whoever handled it wore the mark. He turned to Mac, the boldest of the three. Show the town how innocent boys close a gate. Mac barked a laugh, swagger thick. Glad to. He swung the gate shut with a flourish. The crowd leaned in and gasped. A white stripe of chalk streaked bold across his cuff. Jonah held up his ledger sketch, showing the latch scratches. Then he lifted the turquoise band ring Dusty had stolen from the saloon rail, the chalk still faint against its edge. This ring was left loose. This thread, he added, drawing the blue strand from his pocket, was pulled from a fence where they ran. And her affidavit, he tapped Eliza's folded paper, names each of them. These are not rumors. These are facts, seen and touched. The murmurs grew into voices, shifting the weight of the crowd. Mrs. Bell called out, I saw them ride hard that night. One with a turquoise hat band, Prospector. Wicks raised his cane. Crowell's wagon was where it had no business being. Dusty piped up, broom in hand. And I found that button by the wash. Vance Crowell's face reddened, his smile faltering. Lies, all of it. Boys make mistakes, but this is a scheme cooked by Hale to ruin us. Jonah met his eye. Scheme, or truth standing plain? You tell me, Crowell. Can words wipe off chalk? Can talk unmake scratches in iron? The sheriff stepped forward, eyes sweeping the crowd. You've seen it yourselves. Proof speaks louder than argument. These boys tampered with Hale's gate and frightened his stock. The complaint stand's Mac's smirk was gone. Rory and Tate shifted, uneasy, like colts boxed in. Crowell's jaw worked, but no words came. The town had seen too much to look away now. Eliza's breath shuddered, but her shoulders eased as though a weight had lifted. Jonah stood tall, silent once more. The trap hadn't snapped shut with noise or violence, but with daylight and patience. And daylight was harder to deny. The street hearing broke the hush of Raven Wash like thunder rolling away. What had started as whispers now carried the weight of daylight. Sheriff Holt, badge glinting, raised his hand for order. These boys tampered with Hale's corral, frightened his stock, and meant harm. By law, they'll pay restitution, work under the circuit judge, and keep to the straight. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others uneasy. Mac's bravado cracked. His cuffs still showed the chalk. Rory stared at the ground, and Tate shuffled like he wished to vanish. Jonah stood silent, Eliza's affidavit folded in his pocket, the turquoise ring glinting like a nail in Truth's coffin. Then came the uncle's voice, sharp and desperate. Vance Crowell shoved forward, spitting words. Boys make mistakes, Sheriff. Hale's twisting trifles into charges. I was at his lane myself. The sheriff's brow lifted. You admit it? Crowell's mouth snapped shut too late. Holt seized on it, voice iron. Then, "You tied yourself to the tampered gate. That makes you complicit," gasps Rippled. Crowell's face burned crimson, sweat slicking his temple. The circuit judge, gray and stern, stepped forward. "Mr. Crowell, your freight license is suspended 30 days. You've meddled where you had no right," Crowell sputtered, but found no footing. The town had seen enough. For once, power bent, if only slightly. Jonah tipped his hat, quiet as always. "That's all I asked. That truth be seen." Eliza stood taller beside him, her hands clasped firm. For the first time since the creek, her eyes met the crowd's without flinching. There was no shame there now, only a steady kind of dignity. That evening, back at the cabin, silence wrapped the room, not in fear, but in release. Jonah stoked the fire while Eliza laid bread on the table. For once, the chair by the door sat empty, rifle resting in its rack. She broke the quiet with a half smile. "I thought it would feel like victory. Instead, it just feels lighter." "Truth don't roar," Jonah said, ladling stew. "It lifts weight, that's all." They ate in the hush of crickets. When the meal was done, Eliza stepped outside, bare feet brushing grass. Jonah followed, standing near but not close. She gazed across the field where seed furrows cut dark lines in the soil. "I never thought of this place as mine," she whispered. "Maybe it ain't about owning," Jonah said. "Maybe it's about belonging." Her eyes softened, then caught on something glinting near the furrow. She knelt, brushed soil aside, and gasped. Water shimmered faint beneath, a shallow spring bubbling gentle into the cut row. Her hands came away damp, cool with promise. "Jonah," she breathed, "there's a spring." He crouched beside her, touched the damp earth. Feeds the wash from underneath. Hiding all this time, he let the wet soil crumble between his fingers. A quiet abundance, right where we first stood in fear. She laughed, a sound quick and almost shy. "Maybe that's what second chances look like, water where you never thought it'd run." Jonah smiled faintly, gaze fixed on the small flow. "Then maybe this land has more to give than we guessed." The spring trickled on, steady and sure, its sound soft as a lullaby. For a moment, the world felt remade. Fear turned into something tender, shame turned into belonging. Inside, the chair by the door remained empty. Outside, the soil drank from its hidden gift. The weeks that followed felt different in Raven Wash. Trouble no longer prowled Jonah Hale's gate. The boys, fined and ordered to labor under the judge's eye, spent their days mending other men's fences and sweating under honest sun. Crowell's freight wagon sat idle, his temper worn down by consequence. For the first time in years, the town carried itself quieter, like a storm had passed, but left the air clean. At the cabin, life settled into rhythm. Jonah still kept the chair by the door, but the rifle stayed in its rack. His eyes turned more often to the spring. Eliza had uncovered the water-feeding rows of beans she planted neat along the furrow. He watched her kneel in the soil, sleeves rolled, hair loose, laughter sometimes escaping her lips when a breeze lifted the young shoots. One evening she looked up from her work. "You gave me more than shelter," she said. "You gave me the space to stand again." Jonah leaned on the fence rail, sun at his back. "I didn't give it. You took it, piece by piece." That's the stronger way the barn smelled of hay and oil, the cabin of bread cooling on the sill. Eliza baked more now, sharing loaves with Dusty and Mrs. Bell. Folks stopped whispering when Jonah and Eliza rode into town together, heads high. The sheriff kept his word, holding steady against Crowell's bluster. What gossip remained dried up against paper. Eliza's work agreement signed neat, her wages recorded in ink. She wasn't a secret burden. She was a partner by choice. One afternoon, Jonah showed her how to sight a rifle, his hands steadying. Hers. Not for pride, he told her, only for need. She nodded, eyes focused downrange, understanding that self-respect could be as strong as steel. Later, as the beans climbed, Eliza turned to him. "This place feels different now. Not just yours. It was never just mine," Jonah said. He looked out across the land, the light fading to gold. "A cabin's only wood till someone calls it home." Eliza's smile carried the kind of ease born from scars that no longer ruled. She brushed soil from her palms, gazing at the spring that burbled quiet. "Funny, isn't it? That water was always here, waiting. Like it knew we'd need it." Jonah's eyes softened. "Some things hide till you're ready to see them." That night, lamplight warmed the cabin walls. The chair by the door sat empty. Jonah and Eliza ate in peace, bread and stew shared without fear shadowing the table. When the crickets sang outside, Jonah finally let himself breathe full, shoulders loose, heart lighter than he'd known in years. Mercy had stood its ground, not loud, not vengeful, just steady. And in that steadiness, a life had been built. And maybe that's the heart of it, mercy with a backbone, patience that outlasts swagger. If you were Jonah, holding the line with nothing but truth and quiet resolve, how would you have faced those boys and their uncle? Tell me in the comments. And if stories of second chances and steady hands speak to you, share this one or subscribe for the next trail we'll ride together.